My daughter sent me a text message on a Tuesday. Last Tuesday, I was at the kitchen table with my coffee, and it was a normal morning, and then it was not. The message said, "Mom, $500 or no visits. Call it a grandma fee. Transfer it before we schedule anything." I read it twice. My hands were shaking by the second time, not from rage. From something colder than rage, the particular cold that comes when someone you love says something that cannot be taken back, and you understand, in your body before your mind catches up, that something has permanently changed shape. I did not call her. I did not respond. I sat at that table until my coffee was cold. Then I transferred the $500. I had not seen Lily and Noah in 4 months. Lily was 7, Noah was 5. I want you to understand what 4 months is when a child is 5. A child can lose the particular way they said your name. They can stop expecting you. They can begin to structure their world without you in it, and one day you are simply background a photograph on a shelf that adults point to and say, "That is your grandmother," and the child nods because the photograph has always been there, and that is all it has ever been. I was not willing to become a photograph on a shelf. I transferred the money at 11:47 that morning. My hands were still not entirely steady. I confirmed the transfer and sat and looked at the screen. Before I tell you what I found out 3 weeks later about where that money went, I need you to understand how a daughter arrives at a text message like that one. Because it did not begin with $500. It did not begin with an ultimatum. It began 3 years earlier, quietly, in the particular way the worst things always begin, not with a declaration, but with a drift, one small adjustment at a time, until you look up one day and find yourself standing somewhere you never agreed to go. My daughter's name is Rebecca. She is 34 years old. She has 2 children and a husband named David who travels for work, sometimes for 2 weeks at a stretch, sometimes more. She lives 2 hours from me in a house with a yard and a kitchen I helped her choose the countertops for, in a neighborhood she and David selected together the year after Noah was born. I know the layout of that house the way I know most things I love. By walking through it so many times, the path is automatic. Or it was. Rebecca and I were close when the children were small. I was there when Lily was born, and I drove through the night to be there when Noah came early, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Small and loud and perfectly formed. I kept them on weekends when Rebecca and David needed time. I drove 2 hours without complaint, because 2 hours is nothing when someone is waiting for you at the other end. I believed we had the kind of relationship that would hold. I was wrong about that. I did not understand yet what was changing, or why, or who was doing the changing. The first sign was small enough that I almost missed it. Rebecca began using a particular kind of language around visits. She started calling them scheduled time instead of visits. She started saying things like, "I need advance notice to emotionally prepare." She started sending me articles, long articles. Articles about grandmother boundaries and emotional labor and the hidden costs of family visits. I read them all. I tried to understand what she was telling me. I asked her once, directly, whether I had done something that upset her. She said no. She said she was simply doing the work of protecting her own energy. She said she had realized, through her personal development, that unstructured time with family was a drain on her nervous system and that she was building new systems around it. I did not argue. I said I understood. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of a petrol station and cried for 11 minutes. Then I went home and did not call anyone. That was 18 months before the invoice. In those 18 months, the visits became fewer. The calls became shorter. When I did come, something in the house felt staged, the children clean and positioned. Rebecca pleasant in the particular way that pleasant can feel like a wall. David polite and slightly absent. I sat at the table where I had eaten Sunday dinners for 6 years and felt, for the first time, like a guest who had not been enthusiastically invited. I adapted. I learned the new shape. I called before texting. I texted before visiting. I gave notice. I confirmed. I followed every protocol Rebecca introduced without naming it a protocol. Because the alternative was less time with Lily and Noah, and less time was not something I was willing to accept, I want you to understand something before I continue. I am not telling you this story to position myself as a victim and my daughter as a villain. People are rarely that simple. What I am telling you is that I did not see what was happening clearly until the invoice arrived. And the invoice arrived on a Tuesday night, $500, due before scheduling. And something shifted in me when I read it. Not rage, not grief. Something quieter and more precise. A decision. I paid the $500 at 11:17 that night. I confirmed the payment and sent Rebecca the receipt the way she had asked me to send it, with a note that said, "Paid. Please let me know available dates." She responded the next morning with two options: a Saturday, 2 weeks away, between the hours of 10 and 1, or a Sunday the following week, between noon and 3, 3 hours, timed, scheduled, invoiced. I took the Saturday. I arrived at 9:58 and sat in my car at the end of the street until 10 exactly. I had brought things for the children, books for Lily, who was reading above her level, and went through them quickly. A small wooden set for Noah, the kind he liked, pieces that fit together in different configurations. I had wrapped them simply because Lily liked unwrapping things slowly, taking her time with the paper. Rebecca opened the door before I knocked. She was pleasant. The house was clean. Lily came down the stairs and hugged me with the particular careful quality of a child who has been coached about something, and I noticed it because I knew her hugs. I had cataloged her hugs from the first one, a week after she was born, when she was still figuring out her own hands. This hug was present, but measured. She was 7. 7-year-olds do not measure their affection unless they have been taught to. Noah was in the living room. He looked up at me when I came in, and his face did something, a flash of something unguarded, something that wanted to run at me the way he used to run at me, and then it settled. He came to me at a walk. He let me hold him. He smelled the same. He was the same. But something in the space between us had been adjusted by someone else's hands. I stayed for 3 hours. I read with Lily. I built the wooden set with Noah on the floor. Rebecca sat at the kitchen island drinking coffee and occasionally participating in conversation from a distance, the kind of participation that is technically present without being fully there. At 1 o'clock, she said, "I think that's probably a good stopping point for today." She said it warmly. She walked me to the door. She said she would send available dates for next time. I drove home. I counted the miles between me and my grandchildren because I had nothing else to count. I need to tell you what I found out 3 weeks later, because this is where the story changes shape. This is the information that made me understand that the $500 was not about boundaries or emotional labor or nervous systems. A woman I know, not a close friend, someone I see at a weekly class, someone whose name I know and whose face I recognize, came to me one morning and said she had seen something she thought I should know about. She said she had seen Rebecca at a hotel in the city, not passing through, checked in, with a man. A man who was not David. I want to be precise about how I heard this. I heard it standing next to a window with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea. I did not spill the tea. I did not say much. I asked a few questions: when, which hotel, how certain she was. She was certain. She had seen them together twice, the second time in a restaurant where they were not behaving like colleagues or old friends. She said she had debated telling me. She said she was telling me because she would want to know. I thanked her. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The $500. I thought about the timing. David's business trips ran every 4 to 6 weeks, 2 weeks at a stretch, sometimes more. The invoice had arrived on a Tuesday night. David had left for a 3-week trip the preceding Friday. I had not thought about the timing when it happened. I was thinking about it now. I thought about the last 18 months. The new language, the articles about boundaries, the emotional labor framing, the scheduled visits, timed and invoiced, with a 3-hour window on a Saturday when David was home on a weekend between trips. I had been managed. I had been kept at a measured distance and handed protocols and billed for access so that my presence in that house could be controlled, so that I would not drop by, so that I would not arrive unannounced, so that whatever was happening in that house when David was away would remain invisible to me. $500 to ensure my grandmother visits were predictable and contained. I need to stop here and tell you something about what I felt, because it would be easy to assume I felt rage. I felt something, but it was not simple enough to call rage. I felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a pattern you could not name suddenly names itself. Everything I had been explaining to myself over 18 months, the articles, the protocols, the language, the managed warmth, the coached hug from Lily rearranged itself into a shape that made different sense. I had been looking at pieces. I was looking at the picture now. I thought about Lily. I thought about Noah. I thought about the man in that hotel. The man my daughter had been seeing when David traveled. And then I thought about David's schedule. The 2-week trips. Sometimes more. And the house 2 hours away where 2 children lived with a woman who had a man I did not know coming through the door when their father was gone. I did not call Rebecca. I did not call David. I did not call anyone. On a Thursday morning, 9 days after I received that information, I got into my car and I drove 2 hours. I did not announce that I was coming. I had paid $500 for scheduled access, and I was aware that I was violating the protocol. I did not care about the protocol anymore. I had stopped caring about the protocol somewhere between the hotel information and the particular way Noah had walked toward me instead of running. I parked on the street. I sat in my car for 3 minutes. Then I got out and walked to the door and knocked. Nothing happened for a moment. Then I heard something movement, and then quiet, and then more movement. Then the door opened. Lily was standing in the doorway in bare feet. She was wearing pajama pants and a shirt that had come partly untucked. Her hair was not brushed. It was 11:30 in the morning. She looked at me for 1 second, and her face did the thing it had not done at the scheduled visit. It broke open. The measured quality disappeared. She grabbed my hand with both of hers and held on. She said, "Grandma, take us." I said, "What?" She said it again, not loud, not crying. The way a child says something that they have been rehearsing inside their own head for a long time and have finally found the moment to say, "Grandma, take us." And then she pulled my hand toward her and lowered her voice and said, "At night, when Mommy thinks we're sleeping, she cries, and she begs him to stop. And it's not Daddy." I stood very still. She looked up at me. She said, "It's not Daddy." Her voice had the particular flatness of a child reporting something factual that they do not have the vocabulary to interpret, something they have been carrying alone because there was no one to put it down with. Before I tell you what I did next, I need to tell you what I understood in that moment. I need to tell you what those words did to the shape of everything I had been holding since Thursday morning when I got in the car. I had driven 2 hours to confront my daughter about a fee, about a hotel, about the managed distance of the last 18 months, and the $500, and the coached hug, and the articles about emotional labor. That is what I had driven 2 hours for. I was standing at the door now because of something else entirely. It's not Daddy. At night, Mommy cries and begs him to stop. I looked at Lily's face. She was 7. She had been carrying this. I do not know for how long she had been carrying it, but I could see from her face that it had been long enough to become ordinary, the particular resignation of a child who has integrated something frightening into daily life because the alternative is to be frightened every day, and children cannot sustain that. So they catalog it, they file it. They wait for an adult who might be able to do something with the information. I said, "Where is Noah?" She said, "Upstairs. He's watching something." I said, "Where is your mother?" She paused. She said, "She's on the phone." She looked at me with careful eyes. She said, "She doesn't know you're here yet." I said, "I know, sweetheart." She said, "Are you going to take us?" I looked at her for a moment. Her feet were bare on the threshold. The house behind her was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that comes not from absence, but from something held very still. I had been inside that house many times. I knew the sound of it when it was relaxed. This was not that sound. I said, "Go get your brother. Quietly. Don't tell Mom yet." She went. She went without asking why, which told me something about the level of trust she had been storing up in my direction in the absence of contact. When a child does not ask why, it means they have already been waiting for the answer. I stood at the door. I could hear Rebecca's voice from somewhere in the back of the house, the kitchen, or the room beyond it. I could not hear the words, but I could hear the tone. It was the tone of someone trying to keep their voice low while managing something that required volume. Noah came down the stairs in Lily's wake, also in pajamas, his hair pressed flat on one side from sleep or from the couch. He saw me, and his face did the thing that 7-year-olds are still young enough to do before they learn to manage their reactions. His entire face reorganized itself around relief. Not happiness exactly. Relief. The particular kind that children display when something they hoped for has materialized, without them being certain it would. He said, "Grandma," one word, my name, in his voice. I have turned that over many times since. I said, "Hi, sweet boy," he said. "Are you taking us somewhere?" I looked at Lily. She was watching me with the steady gaze of a child who has decided to trust an adult and is monitoring the decision in real time. I said, "Let me talk to your mom first." I said, "Can you two wait right here for me?" They sat down on the stairs, together. Lily put her arm around Noah's shoulders in the instinctive way of an older sibling who has been doing small acts of protection for long enough that it has become automatic. I noticed that, too. I was noticing everything. I walked toward the sound of Rebecca's voice. She was in the kitchen. She was standing at the far end, facing the window, phone held to her ear, her back to the entrance. She was talking in the careful, compressed way of someone who is trying to conduct a private conversation in a house with children in it. I heard enough. Not everything. Enough, she said. I told you it would be handled. She said, "You don't need to come here." She said, "David isn't back until the 15th. I told you that." She said, "I said I would handle it." And then she went quiet, listening. And in the listening, her posture changed a particular collapse, a particular bracing, the body language of someone receiving something they expected and were hoping not to receive. She said, "Please don't do that." And then her voice dropped so low I could not hear the rest of the sentence. I stepped into the kitchen. She turned around. She saw me. The sequence of expressions that moved across her face in the following 3 seconds was one of the most complete things I have ever witnessed. First, shock. Then something below, shock, the particular look of someone whose management system has just failed catastrophically. Then something that wanted to be anger but could not fully find itself before the other things crowded in. She said into the phone, "I'll call you back." She said it without looking away from me. She lowered the phone. We looked at each other across the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had helped her choose the countertops. The same kitchen where I had stood making lunches while the children ran between the table and the yard. The same kitchen I had been invoiced to enter. She said, "You didn't have scheduled time today." I said, "I know." She said, "You can't just show up." I said, "I know that too." She waited. Her jaw was set. She was working to control the conversation the way she had been controlling every conversation between us for 18 months, looking for the point of entry she could manage. But she was also afraid. I could see the fear, and I could see the effort it was taking to keep it from running the expression. I said, "Who were you talking to?" She said, "That's not something I need to tell you." I said, "Lily told me something." The fear moved in her face. She was very still. I said it plainly. I told her what Lily had said, the crying at night, the begging, the clarification that it was not her father. I said it without accusation in my voice, not because I did not feel things, but because accusation at that moment was not the tool for what I needed to do. I said it the way you say something that is simply true and requires only acknowledgement. Rebecca did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the window. She looked at the counter. She looked at her phone, which was face down, next to her hand. She said, "Lily doesn't understand what she heard." I said, "Maybe not. Tell me what she heard." She did not answer that. "I need to stop here and tell you something about my daughter that I have not told you yet, because I do not want you to arrive at the end of this story having built a simple picture. Rebecca was not always this way. Rebecca at 24, before David, before the children, before whatever had shifted in the years I had been watching from a managed distance, Rebecca was direct. She was difficult in the way that people are difficult when they are honest, which is to say, she said what she meant, and sometimes it landed hard, but you always knew where you stood. She and I had fought and fought again and repaired again, with the ordinary friction of two women who are similar enough to irritate each other and close enough not to walk away. I did not always like her choices. She did not always like my opinions. We managed. The woman I was looking at across that kitchen was not the woman I was describing. The woman across the kitchen had spent 18 months constructing protocols and systems and fees, had built a careful architecture of distance around herself and her house, and was currently standing in the ruins of it looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a teenager, and I found something she had been hiding. I said, "Rebecca, tell me who you were talking to." She said, "It's complicated." I said, "I drove 2 hours. I have time." She looked at her phone again. Then she looked at me. Then something in her posture changed the particular change that precedes a decision, the moment before someone steps off something they have been standing on for a long time. She said, "His name is Marcus." I waited. She said, "We've been—" She stopped. She started again. She said, "David travels. He travels a lot. More than he says he does, actually. I found out 2 years ago that some of the trips were not entirely work. He had his own situation. He thought I didn't know. I found out and I didn't say anything, and then She stopped again. She said, "Marcus was someone I met around that time." I said, "How long?" She said, 2 years. I said, "He comes here when David is away." She said, "Not always. Not recently. We've been—" She chose her words, managing some things. I said, "The children hear things at night." She looked out the window. She said, "Children hear everything. They don't always understand what they hear." I said, "Lily understood enough to ask me to take them. She did not respond to that." I said, "Is Marcus the person who was on the phone just now?" She said, "Yes." I said, "He was telling you he was coming here." She did not answer. Which was an answer. I looked at my daughter for a long time. I looked at her the way you look at someone when you are trying to see past the surface of them to something underneath the thing that preceded the protocols and the invoices and the managed warmth. The person who was there before whatever had happened to construct all of this. I could see her. She was still in there. She was also in serious trouble and did not seem to fully understand the shape of what she was standing inside. I said, "Rebecca, when does David come home?" She said, "The 15th. I said, "That's 8 days." She said, "Yes." I said, "And Marcus?" She said, "I told him not to come." I said, "He didn't agree." She said, She looked at the counter. She said, "He has opinions about what I owe him." For the discretion, that word landed in the kitchen and sat there. I said, "He's asking you to pay him." She said, "It's more complicated than that." I said, "Is that where the $500 went?" She went very still. I said, "I'm not asking to make you feel a certain way. I'm asking because I need to understand the situation my grandchildren are living inside." She said he needed something. He was threatening to contact David. I thought she stopped. She said, "It was a temporary solution." I said, "How long has this been the temporary solution?" She said, "A few months." She said it quietly. She said, "It was supposed to stop. He was supposed to. The amounts were supposed to stop increasing and then stop entirely. and she put her hands flat on the counter. She said, "It hasn't stopped." I looked at my daughter, 34 years old, standing in the kitchen she had been so proud of when they bought this house. Two children upstairs, one of whom had been awake at night, listening to her mother cry and beg a man to stop. A husband who had his own situation and did not know what was happening in his house while he traveled. A man named Marcus who had been walking through the door when the children were supposed to be asleep, and who had apparently decided that discretion was a commodity with an escalating price. I said, "He's been taking money from you." She said, "I wouldn't frame it that way." I said, "How would you frame it?" She didn't answer. I said, "The invoice, the $500, the scheduled visits. You were keeping me at a distance because you couldn't manage what was happening in this house and have me close at the same time." She said, She stopped. She said, "I needed things to be contained. I couldn't have you showing up. You notice things. You've always noticed things." I couldn't. She stopped. I said, "You couldn't have me see." She said yes. Very quietly. Yes, we were quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the house, I could hear Lily and Noah. The sound of them. The particular ambient sound that children make even when they are trying to be still. Small adjustments, small sounds, the sound of being alive in a house. I said, "I need you to hear me now. I need you to hear all of it before you decide how to respond." She looked at me. I said, "Marcus is going to come here. He told you not to ask him to stay away, and he told you he was coming, and you told him you would handle it, and he did not agree that it was handled." That is what I heard from the hallway. That is what the phone call was. She said, "I can manage it." I said, "You have been managing it for 2 years, and the amounts have been increasing, and Lily asked me to take her and her brother because she hears her mother crying at night and begging a man who is not her father to stop. That is the situation that your managing has produced." She put her hand over her mouth. She looked at the window. I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me plainly. Has Marcus ever frightened you in a way that felt like more than argument? Has he ever done anything physical?" She was very still. I said, "Rebecca," she said, "he has a temper." She said it like a weather report. Factual. Slightly distant. The way people say things they have learned to normalize. She said, "He doesn't. It hasn't." She said, "He's not dangerous. He has a temper." I said, "Does he have it at night, when the children are supposed to be asleep?" She closed her eyes. I said, "I'm going to take Lily and Noah today. Not because I'm removing them from your life. Not because I'm making a decision about your marriage or your choices or any of the things that are between you and David. I'm taking them because Marcus is on his way here and I am not leaving my grandchildren in this house when that happens. You can come with me. All four of us can go right now. Or I can take the children and you can stay and do what you need to do. But I am not leaving them here." She said, "You can't just—" I said, "I know I paid for scheduled time and this is not the scheduled time. You can bill me for it later if that helps. Right now, I need you to tell me if you're coming or staying." She looked at me for a long time. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's chin, and she was 34 years old, standing in the ruins of a system she had built very carefully, and I could see all of that at once. I had loved her for 34 years. I was not going to stop because the system was in ruins. That is not how it works. She said, "If I come." Her voice broke slightly. She pressed it back into control. She said, "If I come, I have to tell David." I said, "Yes." "Eventually, you do." She said, "It's going to end my marriage." I said, "I don't know that. I don't know what you and David are or what the last 2 years have meant for what you are to each other. I only know what I know." She said, "It's going to end it." I said, "Maybe. But right now the only question is whether Lily and Noah are in this house when Marcus arrives. And the answer to that question is no. So please get some things for the children, and let's go." She stood at the counter for a moment. She was very still. Then she moved. She moved the way people move when a decision has been made that costs something deliberately, without hesitation, as if hesitation now would make the cost unbearable. She went to the cabinet. She got the bag she kept for overnight trips. She went upstairs. I could hear her, above me, movement, drawers, the particular sounds of preparation. I went to the hallway. Lily and Noah were still on the stairs where I had left them. Lily was watching me. Noah had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the absolute efficiency of a 5-year-old who can sleep anywhere, anytime, in any emotional climate. Lily said, "Are we going?" I said, "Yes." She said, "All of us?" I said, "Yes, all of us." She looked at me for one more moment. Then she nodded, once, with the composure of a child who has been doing the work of composure for longer than any 7-year-old should have to. And she nudged Noah gently and said, "Wake up, Noah. We're going with Grandma." He woke up and looked around with the specific confusion of a child roused mid-sleep. He looked at Lily. He looked at me. He said, "Are we going somewhere good?" I said, "Yes, somewhere good." He accepted this with the clean efficiency of a 5-year-old whose grandmother has just confirmed that the destination is good. He stood up and held out his hand for mine, and I took it. We were in the car 20 minutes later. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat and did not speak for the first 40 minutes of the drive. The children were in the back, Noah asleep again almost immediately, Lily quiet, looking out the window at the road going by. The landscape flattened and then began to change as we moved. Nobody said anything for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people inside, a moment that is still unfinished, still becoming what it is going to be, not ready yet to be spoken about. Rebecca said, "How long has Lily been saying things like that?" I said. That was the first time she said it to me. She said, "She told me once, a few weeks ago." I told her she misunderstood. She looked at me with this face, and then Rebecca stopped. She was quiet. Then she said, "I told a 7-year-old she misunderstood what she had heard in the dark, in her own house." I did not respond to that. I let her sit with it. She said, "I thought I was protecting them." I said, "I know." She said, "I thought if I kept it managed, if the parts stayed separate, if the children never had context for what they were hearing, I thought that was protecting them." I said, "Yes." She said, "It wasn't." I said, "No." She looked out the window. She said, "I don't know what David and I are going to look like after this." I said, "You don't have to know that today." She said, "I owe you $500. I said, "You don't." She said, "I invoiced you." I said, "Rebecca." She said, "I invoiced my own mother for seeing her grandchildren because I needed money, and I couldn't explain why I needed money, and I built a whole system around it so it would look like—" She stopped. She said, "What did it look like?" I said, "It looked like boundaries." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She said, "That's what I intended." I said, "I know." She said, "Did you believe it?" I thought about this for a moment. I said, "I believed you were building something to keep me at a distance. I didn't understand why yet. I'm a mother. I adapt." She said, "I made you adapt around a lie." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." We drove. The road moved under us. In the back seat, Noah breathed the even deep breathing of an untroubled sleep, and Lily sat with her knees drawn up and her forehead leaning lightly against the window glass, watching the world go past. The afternoon had turned golden, the kind of light that makes ordinary landscapes look more significant than they are. I need to tell you something about the week that followed, because this story did not resolve in a day. Things of this kind do not resolve in a day. They resolve in increments, over time, through conversations that are hard, and then harder, and then unexpectedly easy, and then hard again in a new place. Rebecca called David from my house that evening. She went into the guest room and closed the door, and I sat with Lily and Noah in the living room and read to them for an hour and a half, the same books I had brought to the scheduled visit 2 weeks before. the ones I had carried in a bag to a 3-hour window. Noah fell asleep in my lap. Lily made it to the end of 2 chapters before her eyes started losing the battle. I could hear Rebecca's voice through the door. Not the words, the voice. It was a long conversation. It had silences in it. It had the sound of things being said that could not be unsaid. When she came out an hour and 40 minutes later, her eyes were red, and she sat down on the floor against the wall in the hallway outside the guest room, and I sat next to her. She said, he knew. Some of it. Not Marcus, not specifically, but he knew something had happened. He said he had known for about a year. I said, did he tell you about his situation? She looked at me. She said, I told you about that? I said, you mentioned that he'd had one, that you found out 2 years ago. She said, yes, he told me. He said he ended it when she paused. She said, he ended it 8 months ago. He said the travel changed after that. He said he's been trying to come back toward us, and he didn't know how to say it because he didn't know if I still— She stopped again. She said, he didn't know if I still wanted him to. I said, do you? She said, I don't know what I want. I know what I don't want. I don't want Marcus in my house. I don't want my daughter hearing things in the dark she can't interpret. I don't want to bill my mother for scheduled time. I don't want any of that. Whether that becomes a marriage again or something else, I genuinely don't know. I said, that's an honest answer. She said, it's the first completely honest thing I've said to anyone in 2 years. She leaned her head back against the wall. She said, what did Lily's face look like when she saw you at the door? I told her. I told her what it looked like when the measured quality disappeared, when the coached composure came apart and she grabbed my hand with both of hers. Rebecca closed her eyes. I said. She held on. She said, I know. She does that. She's been doing that since she was 2. She grabs with both hands. I said, she gets it from you. Rebecca opened her eyes and looked at me. She said, from me, I said. You used to do the same thing. When you were small and something frightened you, you grabbed with both hands and you did not let go. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I let go of you. I said, you did. She said, for 2 years I invoiced you and scheduled you and built a system to keep you 3 hours and $500 away. I said, yes. She said, and you paid it. You just paid it. You didn't fight me. You didn't argue. You adapted. I said, you were keeping me from Lily and Noah. I would have done more than pay $500. She put her face in her hands, not crying, just putting her face there, into her hands, the way people do when something is too large to hold with your expression visible. I sat next to her on the floor of the hallway and let her do that. David came home on the 9th day instead of the 15th. He drove through the night and arrived at my house at 5 in the morning, and I made him coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table without Rebecca, who was asleep, and he said, tell me what the children were living with. He said it plainly. He said, I need to understand what was happening in my house. I told him what Lily had said at the door. I told him about the crying at night, the begging, the clarification that it was not Daddy. I told him the way Lily had said it without drama, flatly, with the factual quality of a child reporting something they have filed under ordinary. David put his cup down on the table very carefully. He did not say anything for a moment. He said, Lily is 7. I said, yes. He said, she told you this. I said, she was waiting for someone she trusted to say it to. He said, and Noah. I said, Noah is 5. He knows something is wrong in the way that 5-year-olds know, not through language, but through their body. He was relieved when I came. David sat with that. He said, I'm going to need some time to understand what I am in the context of my own marriage. I said, that seems reasonable. He said, I don't know if Rebecca and I are fixable. I genuinely don't know. I said, I don't know either. But your children are in the next room and they are fine, and you are here. And whatever else has to happen between you and Rebecca has room now that Marcus is not in it. He said, is he fully out? I said, Rebecca made calls. She handled it. He said, With my parents involved? I said, no. She found her own way. There were some conversations that apparently made the situation clear to him. He looked at me. He said, my wife has more spine than I gave her credit for. I said, she gets it from somewhere. He looked at his coffee. He said, I'll tell you something. I drove here through the night, and I don't regret any of the driving. I'm going to be in that room with my children when they wake up. Whatever happens with everything else, I'm going to be in that room. I said, yes, that's exactly right. He went to the room where Lily and Noah were sleeping. I heard the door open, and then nothing, for a long time. I made myself more coffee. I sat at the table and watched the light change in the window as the morning came in. Noah found me first. He came out in his pajamas, hair pressed flat, eyes still adjusting, and saw me at the table and came directly to me and climbed up into my lap without asking and settled there with the complete confidence of a child who has found the safe location and has no intention of relocating. I held him. I did not say anything. He was warm and heavy and smelled of sleep and of himself, and I sat at the table with my grandson in my lap and watched the morning arrive. Lily came out 15 minutes later with David. She saw Noah in my lap and came to my other side and leaned against my arm. David sat across from us. We were quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of people who have arrived on the other side of something and have not yet found words for the terrain. Lily said, Grandma. I said, yes. She said, are you coming back? I mean, after this. Are you going to come back? I said, yes. She said, not just for scheduled time. I said, no, not just for scheduled time. She looked at me. She said, you don't have to pay anything. I said, I know. She said, the fee was Mommy's idea, but I didn't like it. I looked at her. I said, I know you didn't, sweetheart. She leaned harder against my arm. She said, I'm glad you came. I'm glad you came when you weren't supposed to. David looked at me across the table. He said nothing. He did not need to. I want to tell you something about what came after. Because it did not end that morning at the kitchen table with the light coming in. It continued, the way all real things continue, not in a line but in a spiral, coming back around to familiar places at slightly different heights. Rebecca and David went to work on their marriage with the same seriousness that people bring to things they have decided to fight for. It was not smooth. There were weeks that were harder than the week that had preceded them. There were conversations that did not go well, and then conversations that went better, and then silences that were productive rather than hostile. The invoices stopped. This is a small thing and a large thing simultaneously. Small because of course they stopped. There was no system left to enforce them. Large because the space where they had been filled, gradually, with something else, calls that Rebecca made not to manage me, but simply to talk. Visits that were not scheduled in the 3-hour window sense, but simply arranged with the normal consideration that people arrange things when they are living parallel lives and need to coordinate. My car in her driveway on a Tuesday. Lily's voice on the phone describing something that had happened at school. Noah sending me a drawing of something he said was a lion but was shaped like a rectangle with legs, which I framed. The box that had been built around me over 18 months did not vanish. It dissolved, slowly, the way boxes dissolve when they are no longer being maintained. You stop noticing the walls when no one is tending them. I need to tell you about a Sunday 6 weeks after that Thursday drive. I need to tell you this because it is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about what the story was actually about. I was at Rebecca's house for dinner. David had made something elaborate. The children had set the table with varying degrees of usefulness, Lily correctly, and Noah creatively. We sat together and the conversation was the ordinary conversation of people who are navigating something real and have not finished navigating it but have found, in the meantime, a way to sit at the same table without the navigation being all there is. Lily said, at some point, something I had not expected. She said, Grandma, why did you come that day, even though it wasn't your day? The table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when a child says the thing everyone has been orbiting without quite landing on. I said, because you were there, and I needed to see you, she said. But you didn't know I was going to tell you that thing. I said, no, I didn't know, she said. So you just came? I said, yes, I just came. She thought about this. She turned her fork over in her hands. She said, I'm glad you just came. I said, me too. She said, next time you want to just come. You can just come. You don't have to wait. I looked at Rebecca. Rebecca was looking at her plate. Her jaw was doing the thing it does when she is managing an emotion that she has not decided to display yet. I said, thank you, Lily. She said, you're my grandma. You don't need a day. She went back to her dinner. Noah had been watching this exchange with the philosophical patience of a 5-year-old who does not fully follow the conversation, but understands from the energy that something important is happening. He looked at me and said, yeah, Grandma, you don't need a day. I said, okay, I won't need a day. He said, good. Can I have more? I need to stop here and tell you something about Noah specifically. Because this story belongs to Lily, in many of the obvious ways, she was the one who opened the door. She was the one who said the thing. She was the one holding information in both hands, waiting for someone to receive it. But Noah carries this story too, in the way that younger children carry things not in words, but in their body, in their choices, in the small behavioral evidence of what they have absorbed. In the weeks after that Thursday, Noah started something new. When I arrived at the house, any visit, scheduled or not, planned or spontaneous, he started coming to the door before I knocked. Not every time. Often enough that Lily noticed and said once, he knows when you're coming. I said, he can probably hear the car. Lily said, it's not the car. She said it the way 7-year-olds say things that are accurate in ways they cannot fully articulate definitively, without elaboration, confident in the fact even without the framework. What I think it was, Noah, at 5, had recalibrated his internal map of what safety felt like. For some period of time that I cannot precisely date weeks, months, the particular unmeasured duration of early childhood the house had contained something his body understood as unpredictable. The man who came at night, the crying, the begging. A 5-year-old does not have words for these things. He has sensations. He has a nervous system that catalogs threat and files it the same way Lily cataloged information, except in a different language. His language was the body. And then I came, and then the thing changed. And his body knew it had changed even before his mind had the story for why. He came to the door before I knocked because I was part of the new calibration. I was a signal that the house was in its safe configuration. I know this because after David came home and the house stabilized after Marcus was gone, and the conversations had happened, and the air in the rooms changed the way air changes, when something heavy has been removed, Noah still came to the door. He came to the door because I was coming, and I was good, and that was the whole reason. He said, good. Can I have more? David served him more, and the conversation moved the way conversations move at dinner tables when a child redirects them. And we ate, and we talked, and the light came through the kitchen window the way it did, and I sat at the table in the house I had helped choose the countertops for, and I stayed through dinner, and I stayed through the dishes, and I stayed until the children were in bed, and then I sat with Rebecca and David for another hour in. The quiet of a house where the children were sleeping, and nothing frightening was coming. When I left, it was late. Rebecca walked me to the door. She said, thank you for the Thursday. I said, you would have found your way out of it. She said, I don't know that. I said, I do. She said, Mom, the invoice. I said, yes. She said, I'm going to be thinking about the invoice for a long time. I said, that's probably fine. Some things are worth thinking about. She said, I made you pay to see your grandchildren. I said, you did. She said, and you paid. Without fighting me. I said, yes. She said, why? I looked at her. I said, because you were between me and Lily and Noah, and I would have paid anything you asked. That is not a complicated answer. She looked at me for a moment. Then she did the thing she had not done in a long time. She grabbed my arm with both hands, the way she used to when she was small and something had frightened her. She held on. I held on back. There is something else I want to tell you about Marcus. Not in detail. Not because he deserves narrative space, but because what happened with him is part of what I mean when I say, Rebecca has more spine than people gave her credit for. She handled it herself. She made 2 phone calls and then a third, and by the end of those calls, the situation had been made sufficiently clear to him that he did not test the clarity. I do not know exactly what she said. She did not tell me exactly, and I did not ask. What I know is that she was precise, and she was not afraid of him anymore, which was the relevant variable. Fear had been the architecture of his access. When the fear went away, the architecture had nothing to stand on. She told me once, in an indirect way, that the thing that changed the fear was Thursday. She said, when you pulled up without warning, something recalibrated. Like I could see the size of things differently once you were inside them. He had seemed very large. He had seemed like the largest thing in the situation. And then you were at the door, and he was just a problem. A solvable problem. I said, that's a kind way to describe a grandmother knocking on a door. She said, it's an accurate way. I want to tell you one last thing before I finish. The $500. I have thought about it many times since that night at 11:17 when I transferred it and sent the receipt and waited for available dates. I have thought about what it cost and what it bought and what it meant in the shape of the story. It bought me a 3-hour Saturday. It bought me a coached hug from a 7-year-old who had been taught to measure her affection. It bought me 2 hours of sitting at a table where the warmth was technically present but not quite alive. That is what $500 purchased. But it also kept me in range. It kept me close enough to drive 2 hours when I needed to. It kept me close enough that Lily had a grandmother to wait for someone she believed, at 7 years old, would come if the situation required it. She had been cataloging the information, filing it, waiting for an adult who might be able to do something with it. She had been waiting for me specifically. I showed up on the wrong day, outside the scheduled window, without an appointment, having violated every protocol in the system that had been built to keep me at a managed distance. It was the best thing I ever did. Some doors need to be knocked on before the knock is expected. Some children are standing on the other side of those doors in bare feet, holding information they have been carrying alone, waiting for the right person to give it to. You do not need a scheduled day for that. You do not need to have paid for the privilege. You just need to drive.